thank you very much. Thanks for giving me this chance to present some of my sort of thoughts about these connections. And as was mentioned, the task I've been given is to sort of try and convince you, or at least give you some sense that as engineers, as people who would like to study science and engineering and computer science, biology is something we should care about, and is something that we can learn from and we can also contribute to. So let me start with a question. How many of you hate biology? Any more? You can answer honestly. No punishment. Okay, quite a few. Is there anyone who loves biology? Okay, not bad, not bad. So we have about a 50-50 split. Okay, so I can tell you I used to hate biology when I was at your stage. And first thing is, sorry. So I think one of the things we often don't appreciate about biology in the way it's taught in our school system is that it really is a sort of scientific enterprise, and there are sort of general principles and ways of thinking about life, about biology, which are similar to physics, let's say, right? I mean, the idea of science is that you have lots of things you can observe in the world around you, and then there are certain concepts, rules, theorems that you can come up with to unify things. So Newton is known as sort of one of the founding fathers of science in general, physics in particular. And his sort of most famous insight, the one that we sort of remember him by anecdotally, is that he saw an apple fall, or in some versions it fell on his head. And he made this link between the force that attracts the apple to the earth and the force that keeps the moon in its orbit around the earth, which you might have thought are two very different sorts of phenomena, but there's this notion of gravity as a single force that could attract things together, and that could also, at longer distances sort of keep things in a certain orbit, was a great insight which unified this, and then of course he was able to come up with a mathematical formulation for this. So we'd like to see, how does biology fit into this way of thinking, this scientific abstract way of thinking. So I want to talk about examples in biology, but I'll start with something quite different, because this talk is not just about biology, it's about connections. So let's take a look at this picture. Any guesses to what this is, what this represents? Yeah? Sorry? Can you describe what that is? No, this is not a chemical structure, okay, but it could have been. Okay, so one guess. Any other thoughts as to what this is? So let me give you a hint. This has something to do with Facebook. Now, any guesses?
How many people are linked on Facebook and compared to the
Yeah, that's what it is. Obviously, it's a small number of people. So it is in fact just sort of my Facebook friends. As you can see, I'm not a very popular person. I have only a few Facebook friends. What you see here is a sort of way of representing connections with people, which is called a graph or a network. Okay, so this is something which is one of the key areas of computer science, is sort of graph theory networks. So here each node is a person, and the colors, as he said, are sort of different categories. I'm not sure if you can read these clearly, but basically these are sort of, in my case, the big groups are the different kind of communities or places that I was at. So there's my college, the place where I did my PhD, my school, and then there's a group for my family here. So the interesting thing about this graph, when you plot it in this way, I'm not on this graph, right? These are all my friends, and which of them are connected amongst themselves. So you see these sort of very densely connected things, right? Which are called cliques in graph theory language. So basically, more or less, everybody knows everybody else, right? In this group, everybody is linked to everyone, and similarly, this purple one here, then green one here, this red one here. So this is a property we often see in real world social networks. So this kind of thing is referred to as a social network, where sort of your identity in some sense, or who you are in society, is defined by the groups you belong to, right? So you have a group of college friends, you have a group of school friends. Once you go to work, you have a group of friends at work, you have your family, you have maybe your neighbors. Right? So there are sort of 4 or 5 at least distinct groups that all of us are part of, and within that group, we have sort of these cliques. So this is just an illustration of the kind of thing you can do by looking at a graph. You can sort of get out a picture like this, and if any of you were to take your Facebook network and plot it, you would see something similar. You know, possibly you would have a much bigger network, but it would look similar. You would see cliques like this. So why is this kind of thing interesting to us if we are talking about biology? We'll come to that. But one thing I want to get across is that this notion of thinking of sort of systems that consist of lots of small bits that have some sort of connections applies to a lot of domains, right? And here we are talking of actually social systems. People, these dots on the graph, somebody said this was a sort of chemical molecule, right? So you could have a graph that represents a chemical structure, you could have a graph that represents a sort of railway network, you could have a graph that represents a network of computers. So many different kinds of systems, completely different real world systems, can be sort of pictured or visualized in this kind of fashion, set of points connected by lines. And we'll sort of come back to this a bit later. Okay, so let us now start to talk a little bit about biology, and then we'll see why networks are interesting in biology. So the fundamental unit of biology in some sense is the cell, right, which all of you have studied. Just like in physics, we think of atoms or molecules as the fundamental units which make up everything. If you think of a living organism, a human being, an animal, a plant, whatever, they are made up of cells, right, at the base unit. Each cell is kind of a full-fledged living thing which carries out functions. And there are lots of different types of cells. So this is one of the interesting things about cells. So you sort of have something called a stem cell. Does anyone know what a stem cell is? Any idea what a stem cell is? Yeah? Yeah, not necessarily the brain. It's essentially sort of a cell which can become any other type of cell, right? So it's like a sort of new cell you can think of, which has, which has not yet specialized into one type. So these are sort of groups or colonies of stem cells. Okay, so these are sort of kind of newborn cells, you can think of them as. And then as we know, there are many different types of cells we have in our body. So if you think of different organs, there are these sort of cells which are part of the heart. And so their main function collectively is to sort of pump blood to the whole body, which carries oxygen, which carries various nutrients. So they have a specific function, and they are sort of, in effect, designed for that. It's like they're engineered for that, except that, of course, nobody actually engineered them. They have somehow come about naturally. They've evolved naturally. Like these are red blood cells. So these are actually cells that are in the blood. They sort of carry oxygen to different parts of the body. These are brain cells or neurons. So they consist of this kind of structure where these are actually rather like you have networks of these cells which are very much like electrical circuits in some sense. So you have electrical signals that actually come down all of these different inputs, and then they somehow get combined or integrated, and you get some sort of output going out. So one interesting question is, all cells start out like this, okay, and then somehow they become very, very different, right? These cells, they look different, they have different structures, they have different shapes and sizes, they do very different things. How is it that the same starting point gives rise to so many different kinds of cells, right? How does this cell have the capability to do so many different things? This is one of the most interesting questions in biology, and the answer which we don't fully understand, but we have some pieces of the puzzle. The answer has to do with what is inside cells. Okay, so just like a cell is the building block of a living organism, the building block of the cell itself is a protein. Okay, so much of this talk is going to be related to proteins in some fashion or other, because proteins really are the fundamental units inside cells. So let's take a look at a few proteins. So these are just again visualizations of different kinds of proteins. This is hemoglobin. So I'm sure many of you have heard of hemoglobin. Do you know what hemoglobin does? Yeah, so it is responsible for the red coloration of the blood, but what is its function? Why is it? Yeah, exactly. So it is what carries oxygen, so it binds to oxygen and transports it. So this is that actual chemical depicted like this, right? So protein is just a huge molecule. This is myoglobin, which is a related thing. This is the structure of an antibody, which is another type of protein that fights diseases. So these are just examples, but we actually have many different types of proteins. So inside a human cell, there are about 20,000 different types of proteins that you can have. And these proteins are a bit like, you can think of them like blocks of Lego in some sense. I said they're the building blocks. So just like, you have a Lego set, or you all know what Lego is, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's sort of a toy construction kit. So you can sort of fit these blocks into each other and build bigger structure. Some pieces are built to sort of fit into each other, some pieces don't fit. So each one has its place, right? Each one has a different sort of role, and they combine to produce bigger structures that can carry out some task. But in the case of Lego, you're just sort of building things. But here, these are sort of actual molecules that do things, right? So they're responsible for producing energy in the cell. They're responsible for responding to various sorts of stimuli, like drugs or whatever it is. So all the sort of functioning that is happening inside the cell is being carried out by groups of proteins. And now this question about how do you get all those different types of cells, well, actually the differences are exactly in terms of how these proteins combine. So just like you can take one Lego kit and you can build so many different things with it, right? So it's the same set of blocks, but by combining them in different ways, you can get a huge variety of different things. So similarly here, what the cell has, it kind of has a Lego kit, or it has a set of recipes for building these proteins, which are the building blocks, and then you can combine them in lots of different ways. And you can get things like the heart cell, you can get things like the brain cells, you can get all these different sorts of exotic structures which do all these things that we need in our body. So this is sort of a rough notion of how you get this variety in cells and what the importance of proteins is, right? So yeah, so now let us just take a short kind of detour into something slightly different. So we've talked about networks. I showed you a social network. So and then I've told you about proteins. Now we are going to bring these two ideas together and see why that is of interest. Before I do that, just a slight kind of historical aside on networks or graphs themselves. So we looked at a social network. So this idea of studying graphs or networks goes back a long way. It goes back at least sort of 300 years. So, what is a graph? You've seen examples. It's just any set of points connected by lines is a graph, right? So anything like this is a graph. That's all it is. It's very simple. Graph or network, I'm using both words interchangeably. And as I said, these points could be people, these points could be proteins, these points could be computers or cities or whatever, depending on what we're looking at. So, does anyone know this picture? Has anyone seen this picture? Yeah, what is this?
That green is a liquid.
Is?
Liquid.
No. So you seem to be, yeah.
These are the bridges.
Yes. So, do you know where?
So the game theory, I think.
Well, yeah, graph theory sort of, but do you know which city this is? Yeah, so you're right. So actually, this is a city which used to be called Königsberg. Actually, the name is written up here. It's not very clearly visible. So it was a German city Now it is actually a Russian city called Kaliningrad. But this is a picture from about 300 years ago, early 18th century. And at that time there were 7 bridges in the city. So these green things are bridges, and you had these 2 rivers flowing through. And so there was a famous kind of riddle that the inhabitants of the city used to ask visitors or other people. Is it possible to find a path that goes through all 7 bridges in the city exactly once and returns to its starting point? Right? This is the question that was asked, and nobody knew the answer, or if people had answers, they didn't have proofs for them, so nobody could be sure what the correct answer was. And then in around 1735, there was this gentleman from Switzerland called Leonard Euler, who was able to model this thing as a graph, okay, and was able to answer this question. So, how would you model? I mean, what is the graph here? If I just want to draw it kind of like this in terms of points and lines. So, the idea is that each island is a node, right? Each island is one place that you can be at a given point of time. So, if we say this is sort of the central island, so this has 5 bridges going out of it, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Then there's this island on this side, there's this island on top, there's this island below, there are these 4 islands, and then there are 2 more bridges. One of them connects this to this, one of them connects this to this, right? This is correct, right? This is just a way of drawing that. So this is just a graph. Now, therefore, the problem was to find a sort of path within this, which could go through each link or edge exactly once and return to the starting point. So, is this possible? What do you think? Any thoughts? Why is it not possible? Any ideas? Why might it not be possible? Why might it be possible? So actually the answer isn't very hard. I mean, one way to think of it is, supposing you start from this island, right? Just to say, supposing you start from you have to start somewhere. So if you are on this island to begin with, and you start following some path, right? So you have to take some bridge that goes out of this island. Now, next time you come back to this island, you'll have to take some other bridge, because you're not allowed to take a bridge twice. Okay? So when you return to this island, you'll have taken how many bridges? You will have taken 2 of the bridges that connect to this island, one out, one in. Now supposing you leave this island again, and then again you come back after some point. How many bridges will you have taken now in total? 4 that connect to that island. So if I have to start somewhere and return to that point, what is the property of the number of bridges that I am taking? What kind of number does it have to be? An even number, right? It has to be 2, 4, 6, 8. It can't be an odd number. So, but how many bridges connect to this island? 5, right? So that's an odd number. So we've done it, right? We've proved it. That's all it is. This is what Leonard Euler proved 300 years ago. And at that time, mathematics was sufficiently in advance that he became famous just for this, which we have done in 2 minutes. So this is how great discoveries happen. But that's all. So basically, what you need is you need a graph where every node has an even number of links or bridges, in this case, going out of it. Right? If there's even one node that has an odd number, it doesn't work, because if you need to end up at the same node, and for every node you go in, you go out, you go in, you go out. So it always has to be an even number. Okay, so this was just to tell you about the very first kind of graph theoretic problem that was solved, and this is how graph theory got started. But since then, in the almost 300 years, it has expanded into a huge discipline, and it is studied in so many different areas. So, as I said, computer scientists, of course, are interested in graph theory. It's fundamentally a sort of mathematical discipline. Electrical engineers have looked at. I mean, you've all studied circuits, right? Circuits of resistors and capacitors and all those things. And you have done laws like Ohm's law and Kirchhoff's law, which tell you about the behavior of connected circuits. So, circuits are also graphs, right? So, any system that consists of things that are connected together can be thought of as a graph, and so that's why it has been so widely used. Sociologists, biologists, physicists, everybody has found uses for these things. So now we were talking about proteins, right? Come back to the biology bit. And we said that, well, there are thousands of different kinds of proteins, there are 20,000 kinds of proteins, they are like these building blocks, these pieces of Lego. You can combine them in lots of different ways and come up with all sorts of different structures which are different types of cells which do different things. So we can actually model the way that these proteins interact in a graph as well, right? Because again, if each of these is sort of a Lego piece, then there are certain kinds of pieces that can connect to each other and others which cannot, right? So this is an actual graph of proteins. This is not from humans, this is from yeast, right? You know yeast, right? It is used in baking bread and all that sort of thing. So it's a sort of microorganism. It's a fungal organism. It's not as complicated as us, obviously. It has 6,000 proteins, so not quite as many as us, but still a lot, right? So and this is some subset of those proteins, and this graph is showing sort of which proteins can somehow connect to each other, right? So they have some kind of physical or chemical interaction by which they can bind. And then what I've done here is the coloring is actually similar to that Facebook network I showed you, right? So it's been done sort of things which are kind of part of the same group have the same color, right? So you can see all these colors are kind of things which are densely connected, right? They're all sort of connected to each other. So you see, this is sort of the power of abstraction, right? We are thinking of two extremely different kinds of things, and this is what I was again talking about with this idea of Newton and gravity. That two things that at first sight might seem completely unrelated. You have these proteins, which are these big chemical molecules floating around inside a cell, binding, interacting. What does that have to do with this? This is people making friendships and talking on Facebook. Does it have any connection? You'd think not, but these two look quite similar once you draw them this way. Why do they look similar? Does anyone want to try and say why they look similar? I've told you part of the answer, but anyone want to try and express it? Why are these two things, why do they look similar? Does it tell us something? So I said for this one, that what this is sort of showing is that the way we as human beings behave, the way our sort of social lives are organized, is that we are part of groups, right? And within that group, sort of everyone knows everyone else. And so our social network looks like this, right? I have a group of friends from school, from college, from neighborhood, from family, and so on. And that's how my social relationships are organized. So the thing is that these proteins also kind of behave in the same way, right? A protein is defined sort of by which other proteins it can talk to. When I'm using talk to in a kind of metaphorical sense, right? As in it can have some kind of interaction with physical or chemical. So and so you see these sorts of dense groups which tell you that basically a protein fits into a larger group, and that group kind of defines what the protein does. So some of these groups are sort of big clusters of proteins that are responsible for, let's say, manufacturing new proteins. They're responsible for producing energy, so sort of metabolism, digesting food and producing energy. They're responsible for producing new cells. So all the kinds of biological functionality that we have studied about, right, is carried out by groups of proteins. Right? They are kind of, as we said, the building blocks which construct these machines that are there inside the cell. And each of those machines has many different proteins. So each protein is part of a group, a community, or it may be part of multiple groups as well in some cases. But you see this type of picture emerge for that reason. And so we see that now some ideas which may have been developed in the study of social networks, because in all of these, what are we trying to do ultimately? We are trying to somehow, by drawing the system in this way, by looking at how things interact, we are trying to understand something about how the system works, how the behavior we see is related to kind of the basic units that go into it. And this kind of commonality means that possibly we can take some idea from social networks and apply it to biology, right? Maybe in social networks, people have found that, when you see this kind of structure, so one thing, for example, that is sort of obvious, but you find that there are often some people in these networks that have a lot of connection, right? So this one, it may not be very clear because this is of a single person, but It's like some people are very popular, right? So we know this on social networks, it's very obvious. There are some celebrities who everybody wants to be friends with or follow, and they keep getting more and more friends, right? So there are some very, very popular nodes or people, and they have certain kinds of properties, right? I mean, so if obviously if somebody like that starts a rumor of some sort, then it spreads very quickly. Right, so one thing of interest on social networks, and what do we use social networks for? Well, one answer is we use them for gossiping. Right, that's in some sense the most fundamental use. So we use them to kind of convey information to each other, and the way this spreads depends on how many things we are connected to. So similarly, people have found that in these networks also, there are some proteins that talk to a lot of other proteins. Right, that is, they go and sort of attach to or they communicate with in some chemical fashion. Many different proteins, and so they are responsible for sort of conveying signals from one part of the cell to the other and sort of keeping things coordinated. So this idea of there being these hub proteins, these central things, is something that also is, you have a similar thing in social networks. This is just one simple example, but this tells you about how you can connect very different kinds of systems at this level of abstraction. Right? Are there any kind of thoughts or questions about anything I've said? I'll just pause for a minute. Okay, so then let's just talk a little bit more about these networks. Now, what I've said so far more or less is that we are interested in proteins, which are sort of the building blocks, and we can think of interaction between them as networks, and networks are also useful in studying social systems and various other sorts of things, and so we see that there is a connection between sort of different disciplines. But specifically, what is the connection between sort of a cell or a biological system and sort of engineering, or why should an engineer be interested in biology? Right, that is one of the themes I wanted to try and look at. And so, just to come to that, so the pictures we've seen so far, the networks, they are sort of static pictures like this, right? They are just a set of points connected by lines. But we want to start thinking of these more as circuits, right? Because what these proteins are they are like different elements in circuits, because they are not just a kind of web, but there are actual signals flowing along them, right? So yeah, so let's just talk a little bit about how these proteins are produced, right? And this again links back to what I said earlier about there being many different types of cells, and different cells have kind of different combinations of proteins, right? Like the heart cell and the brain cell and so on. So how is a protein produced, or what is the connection, let's say, between gene and protein? Okay, so does anyone know what a gene is? I'm sure you've all heard the word, right? What is a gene? Does anyone? Yeah, so they are the units of heredity. So that is how characteristics are transferred from parent to child. But what does a gene actually do? I mean, it has obviously some information which goes. But what is that information? What is the purpose of that thing? Is it related to proteins? How is it related to protein? Any ideas?
Proteins and histones.
The gene is made of proteins and histones. Not quite, no, it's almost protein is made from a gene in some sense. Not made from a gene physically, but yeah, we'll come to that. But okay, I mean, yeah, at least they are connected, yes.
Gene gives instructions on like how to synthesize the proteins.
Yeah, exactly, that's it. So you have studied some biology. Yeah, so that's exactly it, right? So what is a gene? A gene is we can think of it as just a sort of a sentence, right? It's like a long sentence. It's like a long word, even you could say. Just like we have words or sentences in English, except that in this language of biology there are only 4 letters. Right? So the English alphabet has 26 letters. The genetic alphabet has only 4 letters, which are A, C, T, and G. They are called A, C, T, and G. Actually, these 4 stand for 4 different nucleic acids: adenosine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. And so what this represents is actually just a kind of chain of things connected to each other. Okay, so this is what a gene is. It's some long string of letters like this, which carries some information. Now, actually what this is it is the recipe for making a protein, right? So more or less what you said. And the way it sort of works is that if you think of this as a long sentence, in biology the length of a word is fixed, right? So in English we have words of different lengths, which is why we need spaces between words, right? So if I write a sentence in English, I am studying biology, I need to leave spaces between words to tell where one word ends and another word begins. In this genetic language, every word is exactly 3 characters. So we don't need spaces, right? We know where each word starts and ends. There are some special words which tell you where the sentence begins and ends, but we won't go into that. And so what happens is that each of these words actually corresponds to an amino acid, okay, which is and amino acids are the sort of building blocks of proteins themselves. So protein is a big sort of chain of amino acids. So okay, so let us ask the question here: how many different words like this are possible? We have 4 letters in the alphabet. How many words of length 3 are possible? Yeah. 64, yes, that is the correct answer. Right? So 4 into 4 into 4, right? Because each position you can have any of these 4. So you have 64 possible words. There are 20 amino acids that go into at least human proteins. So we have more than enough words, right? So the idea is that each of these words corresponds to one amino acid, right? So we have 20, so maybe ACT corresponds to amino acid number 1, this word might be amino acid number 5, and so on. Right? So then what that means is that this long sequence of DNA, so DNA is the name of this molecule, right, which has these four bits. So DNA is just the kind of physical, it's like the paper in some sense on which this recipe is written, right? And then, so if this is 1, this is 5, this is 7, this is 13, whatever, you get a sort of sequence of amino acid. And then what happens is inside the cell there is a kind of factory, which is called the ribosome essentially, where it puts together amino acids in this sequence. So it kind of reads this recipe and it carries out the recipe. So it puts together these amino acids in this sequence, right, whatever it is, and you get this long chain of amino acids, which is called a polypeptide. And this is essentially what a protein is. And then what happens is that this chain, it folds up in some way. So you have this sort of a phenomenon, this long chain kind of folding up into some sort of structure. And this is what you saw on this earlier slide, right? So these are kind of these squiggly structures. These are just things which are folded up into some kind of structure, right? And then this is your Lego piece, right? And it is defined by what its structure is, because that defines its functionality. If 2 pieces have a particular kind of shape, they could fit into each other and form something bigger. So this is, So this is just a short primer on sort of how genes produce proteins. Now the thing is, this whole process of going from this kind of recipe book, and this recipe book is there in every cell, right? Every cell has the same recipe book, has the same set of genes, the stem cells that we start with, and of course it remains the same. So this is sort of the amazing thing, right? The recipe book is the same, but the sort of actual things which are being carried out in any given cell are different, right? And this is what makes the cells different. So a heart cell is taking some of those recipes and producing those proteins, and then combining them in various ways, and therefore you get that particular structure of a heart cell. A brain cell is doing something quite different, right? So they all have the complete set of things, but they only do some of it, right? And sort of how this happens is kind of the fascinating question, because what decides which recipe to carry out and which one not to? Okay, so this whole process can happen at a certain rate, right? There's a certain speed at which this factory sort of produces these new proteins, right? So the control of how fast this should happen is really done by other proteins, right? So, and this is where this notion of a network now comes in. So it's like, it's a very complicated circuit, right? And actually, if you look at this picture here, this is sort of trying to show the same thing I've just drawn on the paper here in slightly nicer way. So here again you can see this is basically the sort of gene, the DNA sequence, and it's showing that this gene produces a protein and there's an intermediate step. But then what it's also showing is that the speed at which this happens, which the factory is sort of taking this recipe and making this protein, is determined by sort of signals that the cell is receiving, right? So it's getting some signals. Sometimes it gets a signal, start making this protein faster. Other times it gets a signal, stop making this protein, right? So, and where are these signals coming from? They are coming sort of from other proteins. Okay, so it's basically sort of like if the concentration of a particular protein inside the cell goes up, then that's what this signal kind of is, right? So this here says transcription factor. So that is a special type of protein. So if there are lots of copies of this, protein, then it sends a signal that kind of stop making this protein or start making this protein. So if we just come back to the idea of these graphs or networks, but now try to add this element to it, right? So supposing I have this and this, right? This is protein 1, this is protein 2. Okay? So earlier what we were doing was we were just saying, well, if these two proteins can somehow interact, if they have some physical or chemical interaction, some sort of signal can pass between them, we can draw a line, right? That's one simple thing. But now we are saying it's not just this. We are also interested in what kind of signal they exchange, right? So supposing if protein 1, if it goes up, it sends a signal to protein 2 that stop being produced, right? So it sort of inhibits it. So then we can have a sort of direction here, saying that protein 1 affects protein 2, and we can say it sort of affects it negatively, right? That is, if 1 goes up, then 2 goes down. Similarly, we could have a sort of positive effect. Okay, so let's just try to visualize what is going on here in a crude way. So yeah, let me just draw it on this side. So I'm just trying to draw a kind of plot. So we have time, let's say, on the x-axis. We're just now trying to think of how things are changing through time, right? And supposing on the y-axis we have the concentration level. Okay, so this is just as you've done in chemistry, what is the concentration level of a particular protein, a molecule inside a cell. And supposing that we have some protein whose graph looks like this. Okay, so for some period here the concentration rises and then it goes down again. And then we have some other protein whose graph, supposing looks like this, right? I'm just drawing an example. Maybe this is P1, this is P2. Right? Supposing there are two different proteins, and this is how their concentrations are changing with time. So if this is the case, which of these do you think is correct, or is something else correct? I mean, what is the relationship between these two proteins based on this graph? Any guesses about this? How are these two proteins related? Can you tell from this graph? Or can you guess? Yeah.
They have the same junction point. They have made the graph.
They have
two junction points where both are meeting.
Yeah, no, that meeting, forget about me. That's just the way I have drawn it. So these are two independent plots, right? So it's just showing you how over time the level is changing, right? So the idea is just that first at some time point P1, let's say, you have P1 going up, right? So P1's concentration increases. Then sometime later P2's concentration increases. Right? Supposing you see this sort of pattern, right? Maybe you do the experiment many times, Right? This kind of thing comes from actually doing experiments, right? You do this experiment lots of time, then you always see this, that if P1 goes up, then after a few seconds, P2 goes up. So what can you infer from that? What is the relationship between P1 and P2? What could it be? Could it be something like these? So all I'm trying to say is that if P1 goes up, then after a short while P2 also goes up, right? The concentration of P2 goes up. So it would seem, or at least you can guess, that P1 is sending some kind of signal to P2, right? The whole point is just that there is this sort of time lag. So P1 is happening first, and so you can guess that maybe P1 is signaling to P2, right? So P1 is like this signaling molecule. So when it goes up, just like on that plot there, right? So you have these signals coming in. So if P1 goes up, then after a few seconds, P2 starts going up, right? And so you can imagine that it could be this. I mean, that's what I was trying to draw here, right? So the idea was that there is a kind of message or signal that goes from this protein to this protein, and this plus sign says that it tells it to start increasing. Now, supposing the plot instead was like this, or supposing I draw a third protein which shows this kind of pattern, right? So this is P3, right? So P3 shows this kind of pattern. Then what would you guess as to the relationship between P1 and P3? P3 seems to be going down after a while, so it could be something like this, right? It could be this sort of interaction. Okay, so I mean, I'm just trying to say this simply. Of course, in the real network, we have lots of different things, and so it's not just pairs of two proteins, and you can have complications like maybe it's a third protein, maybe there's P0 sitting up here, it sends a signal to P1 and then P1 signals P2, or maybe P0 sends signals to both P1 and P2. So, you know, it's a complicated network, but this is just to show that we can start to do these things, okay? So, by looking at data like this, by looking at, you know, in these experiments how these concentrations change, we can begin to guess how these things are connected, right, and how they signal to each other. So, if you look at this picture, this is just a picture of lots of different kind of groups of genes, proteins. Again, as you've seen, a gene is just a recipe for a protein, right? You can think of both for this as the same for our purposes. So this is like some group of proteins which all behave similarly, and each of these boxes is some cluster or group of proteins. And this picture, which comes from a paper, has been sort of drawn by doing something a bit like what we were trying to do here, right? Of course, it needs much more complicated sort of maths and statistics to do it for a big network. But the idea is you look at lots of experiments like this and you try to find how one thing controls another. Okay? So, what is this? This is like a circuit, right? You study electrical circuits. You have sort of different bits in them. You know, you may have resistors or capacitors or inductors or whatever. You have different components, and you know, you have sort of these signals flowing, these messages flowing effectively from one bit to another. And you know, even if you think of a very complicated kind of machine, right? Think of this laptop. You think of your cell phones, right? They're all inside. They're sort of just a very complex circuit. And we as users don't really know what that circuitry is, right? I mean, we know that we can do certain things and we get certain outputs. But what is going on inside, we don't understand it. Who understands that? The engineer understands that, the person who actually designed it and built it. Which is why if something goes wrong, if our phone stops working, then we have to take it to the sort of specialist, the engineer, to fix it, because we don't know how things work. So, the point is that biology is exactly like that. I mean, our cells are also machines. They have these circuits inside, which are, you know, a representation of all the signaling, all the information flows that are happening. And we don't know what this is, right? The big difference is that in this case, we includes everybody, because nobody knows how it works, right? Nobody designed it. This system was not engineered. It evolved, right? It evolved by a natural process. Or you know, some people would say that God created it, you know, if you believe in God. So that's up to you. But the point is, humans did not create it. So what are we trying to do then? What is this kind of approach to biology trying to do? It's trying to take this complicated system, like a cell, this entire bunch of proteins, this entire network. It's trying to construct these networks, these relationships, just by observing sort of inputs and outputs, right? I mean, so this is sort of an experiment you can do where you give it some input and you observe some behavior. The concentration goes up, and this concentration goes up. So it's a kind of reverse engineering, right? This is sort of the key idea I'm trying to get at. That modern biology is very much reverse engineering, and this is why, as engineers, it is very, very relevant to us. So one way to sort of summarize the message that I'm trying to get across is that well, so one thing I said, for example, so let's think of the problem of trying to repair something, right, which is something we're obviously interested in. If our cell phone stops working, if our computer stops working, in order to repair it, in order to understand how to fix it, we need to know how it works, right? We need to go to somebody who knows how it was engineered. So the sort of engineering or design of that system is necessary to sort of know how to repair it when things go wrong, right? So now for living systems, this repair sort of corresponds to medicine broadly, right? Because when something goes wrong in a living system, so let's say human beings, if we have a disease, if something goes wrong, then we want to try and fix it, and that is what we call medicine. So that's ways of trying to fix things that go wrong, and the corresponding sort of knowledge of how things work inside the system is exactly what biology is, right? So this analogy is just to show that that clearly there is a very direct medical relevance or application of this science, biology in this modern sense, because just as we need to know the internal workings of a machine, a cell phone, or whatever to fix it, we ideally would like to know the internal workings of our bodies, and these basic units of our bodies, which are cells. And if we know that, then we can sort of try to think about how to fix it. And just to give one sort of quick example of an actual disease, so think of cancer, for instance, right? Cancer is an increasingly prevalent disease. It's essentially a disease where cells start growing too fast. Okay, so now we've talked about this kind of signaling system where proteins affect other proteins, and then this final protein which is being produced, let's say in this picture, it goes on to carry out some functionality. Now there are some proteins which are called growth factors that basically tell the cell how fast it should grow, when it should divide into two cells and so on. So there are proteins that control the rate of growth of the cell. So supposing this is a growth factor and it controls how quickly the cell grows. Now if something goes wrong in this signaling circuitry here, and the strength of the signal goes up too much, then what happens? You get too much of this protein, right? So now this is sending a strong signal to the cell, start growing faster. Okay, so the cell starts growing too fast, you get overgrowth of cells and you get cancer, right? So one way to think of what happens in cancer is that some protein starts going haywire, right? It starts behaving like crazy because it's sending out signals too quickly, and that's because something has gone wrong in the circuitry somewhere, right? Somewhere there is a sort of overflow in some sense of information, overdose of information. Now, how do we fix that? If I just give you this very complicated circuit and say, well, it's not working well, it's sort of going too fast. It's like, if you're listening to a radio or something and suddenly the speed of, the voice becomes too fast. Like if you play an audio tape in fast forward or something and you hear these sort of funny sounds. If that happens and you don't know how the radio works, you can't fix it, right? But somebody can know how the radio works and you can come and look at the circuitry. So here, if we supposing we know that there's a particular protein here which is the problem, right? Which is causing the problem, which somehow has stopped working properly, then we can actually design a sort of drug or a medicine. And remember, drugs or medicines are also chemicals, right? Typically, they are also kind of proteins or molecules like proteins which go and which go and bind to protein, which go and somehow talk to proteins. So supposing that this sort of signal A here is sort of overacting, and we are able to see what kind of thing this is. Remember, if we know the structure of this and so on, this is like this sort of Lego piece, and we say, well, I want to sort of stop this from acting. I want to somehow block this. So let me try and design a sort of Lego piece that goes and fits on top of this and prevents it from sending its signal further down. Because to send that signal, it has to, of course, go and attach to this gene. So I can try and design a drug that specifically targets a particular protein, and if I know which protein is causing this disease, then it makes it much easier for me to actually come up with medicines or drugs that can target that. And so this is one very obvious reason why understanding these circuits is extremely important. And in fact, a lot of drug companies, pharmaceutical companies nowadays are extremely interested in this kind of modeling, sort of network modeling of biology, because they realize that these sorts of things are very important to be able to design new drugs and sort of keep in check all the diseases that are cropping up, right? So, okay, so I have just a few minutes left. So let me just talk about one more slightly different sort of strand of something from biology which is of interest to us. So far I have said why engineering is important to biology, right? And why biology is also like an engineering problem, and why as engineers, as computer scientists, we have a lot to contribute to biology, because the kinds of things we are interested in studying are exactly the kinds of things that we also need to understand and make sense of biology. But also, what can we learn from biology? Supposing now, if we think of engineering as being the task of, let's say, producing new technologies, as designing sort of new kinds of machines or systems, the traditional view of engineering. There also, is there something that we can learn from biology? Because remember, biology is a marvel of engineering as well, in some sense, right? Except that it's not human engineering, it's sort of natural engineering. And so, if nature has engineered such wonderful sort of organisms which can do all these things, cannot we as human engineers learn something from that? And in fact, we have learned quite a lot from that. So there's this whole area of sort of bio-inspired engineering or computing. So I just want to say a little bit about that quickly. So, what are these? This is a colony of ants, right? Fascinating things. I mean, I'm sure all of you have observed ants, the way they sort of act in groups. If you spill a little bit of sugar or something somewhere, you must have seen in your homes how the ants sort of find it, and then they sort of set up a kind of conveyor belt where they take the grains of sugar from one place to another and things like that. So they have tremendous abilities to sort of coordinate and carry out tasks. And there's actually an entire family of sort of methods or algorithms in computer science which are called ant colony optimization, which are actually inspired by the way that these ants work. So, yeah, I mean, you think of problems like finding short paths between places, right? And just to try and give one kind of concrete example of this. So we've been talking about networks. Take a computer network, right? Take the internet, which is a big computer network. All the time we come across this problem of having to find a short path. Supposing you send an email to somebody, right? We are in Rajasthan. Supposing you send an email to somebody who is in Kerala, it's a long distance away, 2,000 kilometers. How does it get there? So it obviously goes from computer to computer. It sort of takes many different steps. So you can think of it again as a network. Supposing it starts from this NIIT University node here. So if you send the email, so this is the user. Let's say the first step is it would go to some sort of server, right? It would go to, let's say, your mail server, and then somewhere at the other end is a sort of destination, right? So this is the destination somewhere in Kerala, supposing. So now it has to go through a sequence of servers or computers, right, which might be in different physical locations. It will follow some kind of path, and eventually it will get to this node. But which path should it follow? Right? There are literally tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of these computers, even let's say within India. making up this network, if a user at location A sends an email to a user at location B, how do you find the best path to get from A to B, to get from source to destination? So this is one of the sort of universal problems in graph theory. And I've given you one example. This comes up in lots of settings. In a graph or network, how do you find the sort of shortest or quickest path between two places? Now, these ants are amazingly good at doing that, sort of. They actually have ways of doing this. So if they find a food source somewhere, they forage around for food, and they actually leave a sort of chemical trail behind them. So they sort of, if they find a food source, then, and supposing they have their kind of home, their burrow or whatever where they are, and some of them have gone out in different directions searching for food, and somebody finds food, then he starts leaving this sort of chemical called pheromone, and just leaves a trail. So it's like, you can think of it like some kind of scent or something, right? And so other ants can then smell it and can follow that path back. And so collectively, by sort of leaving many different trails, they come up with sort of the best or most efficient path, right? The one that gets to the source the quickest, and then all the ants are able to find that. So I'm not going into details, of course, but the idea is that they have sort of procedures that have somehow been evolved. So this is also like a sort of engineering, right? Because these ants are behaving in this way collectively, and they are able to solve these kinds of problems. They're actually not easy problems, finding the shortest path in a graph. And that's why, this whole family of methods, which are actually used a lot in computer science and engineering, are sort of inspired by the way these ants work. And there are lots of examples like this. So just the last slide I'll show you a similar kind of thing. People also have been inspired by the way that honeybees search for pollen, right? So we know that honeybees sort of forage around, they search for food, which is for them, which is pollen, and of course in the process they help to pollinate different plants, and so they're a very important part of sort of the ecosystem. But how do they do this? How do they find these sort of sources of pollen? So what is their search strategy, right? So based on, so I'm just sort of writing down another term here, which is to say that this is again something that is sort of Bee's optimization algorithm. Is another term that is used in computer science, because again this search problem is very common, right? I mean, we sort of, again let's go to the internet, which is the most sort of ubiquitous example of a network we have these days. The internet is a sort of mine of information, and the most important tool we need to use the internet is a search tool, right? So we use Google search literally tens of times every day, because we need to find information that we want out of that huge mine of information that's there. So how does Google search work? How do search engines work? Well, they have some kind of method, right, which you give it some keywords and it has to search, and it's doing this search on a big network, right? So it's again, I mean, the internet is a big network of sort of servers and sites and connections and so on. Whatever it is, right? I mean, I've already drawn a kind of crazy picture like this. But the idea is that searching for a particular type of information or point in a system like this is a very important problem. And algorithms for doing that kind of searching have actually been inspired by the way these bees sort of search for their sources of pollen, and then kind of carry pollen from one place to another. So, and again, how are these bees able to do it? I mean, how do they know that this is the thing to follow? Well, they are not intelligent in the sense that we are. I mean, so it's not, I mean, it can't sort of explain what it does, right? But it's somehow engineered into its brain, right? It's hardwired into its brain. So it knows that it has to follow a certain procedure, just like those ants know that they have to do certain things. If they find food, they have to start leaving this pheromone chemical. So all these things have evolved via nature, right? They have evolved because they make the animal fitter, right? They allow the animal to find more food, and so, I mean, this is the theory of evolution which you all would know about. So, but all I'm trying to say is these are fantastic examples of natural engineering which have inspired some very useful methods in actual engineering for computer science and real world engineering problems in whatever discipline. So this relationship sort of goes two ways, right? It's a symbiotic thing, because there's a lot that we as engineers can learn from biology, right? Because it has solved so many problems that we are still struggling with as human beings. And to understand biology in more depth, which is the biological circuitry, the networks that underlie living beings and cells, we need to sort of reverse engineer them. So what we need are precisely the kinds of skills that engineers and computer scientists have. And so it's really a sort of fundamental relationship. And biology in the 21st century really shouldn't be seen as a sort of separate discipline from sort of the physical sciences or maths or engineering, because all of these things are sort of fundamental parts of the tools that we need to actually understand anything about life. And so that's sort of the message I wanted to try and convey. Hopefully you found something of interest in this. So thanks very much, and I'll be happy to take any more